Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's SMECast, this month's event as part of our new project management community here at Learning Tree. Today's event will be a discussion and Q&A with Learning Tree instructor John Moore, where we'll talk about project management careers, on-the-job tips, certification advice, what have you. First of all, I want to briefly introduce you to our project management community and the features available to you as an exclusive member. Everything you need to get the most of your experience is available to you now in your private My Learning Tree account, which I'll go ahead and show you now. So once you log into your My Learning Tree account, you'll want to click the My Memberships bar on the left-hand side here, and that will take you to your memberships page. From the main page here, you can register for upcoming learning events here in the middle of the page. You'll want to join our LinkedIn community group here for tips, reminders, and also access to Learning Tree's project management and Agile experts. They're all real world practitioner instructors, and they are eager to help you with any issues that you might have related to project management. You can also scroll down here at the bottom and browse the collection of curated on-demand micro-learning resources. Those are all available to you. And back to our presentation. So like I mentioned, today's presentation is a discussion on project management and career advice with John Moore. I've come prepared with some questions of my own to lead today's conversation, but remember this event is for you, so I hope you've come with some questions of your own as well. We'll take a quick look at our event platform to make sure you know how to get your questions answered. So if you've ever taken a Learning Tree course with us as a live virtual attendee, you'll likely recognize the Anywhere platform layout here. You'll see John, our presenter, is in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Below John is a chat box. This is where you'll participate with questions or comments. So as you think of questions for John, just type them in that chat box. I'll be monitoring that chat box and relay your questions to get your answers to you. And then, of course, in the middle of the page there is the presentation. So that's it for our housekeeping items at the start of our event. It's now my privilege to introduce you to our subject matter expert of the day, John Moore. John, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive in?
Yeah, hi Jen. Thanks for introducing me. Well, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK, and my background is basically IT, but it wasn't called IT when I started. So I started as a programmer, working in engineering environment actually, doing real-time systems. But as we're talking about project management, what's interesting is that although I progressed through the roles there, I was maybe 22, 23, I couldn't become a project manager, although I was actually working in projects and sort of running elements of projects because I'm not an engineer. And that's really like if you like the old way of looking at things, because it was driven by the role. And then what actually happened was that I had to look to progress, so I got a job working in a more commercial environment, and there was such a big jump because one minute I was dealing with real-time systems controlling power, really writing operating systems, dealing real ones and zeros, working, and then in the commercial world where really my project management took over. So I was doing like investment banking, I worked in payrolls, personnel, and many other areas. But what I hadn't realized is how much I'd learned in my previous job applied in this new job. And then over the time I progressed in doing projects and running projects, still doing some technical work. Moving on, obviously going through the Y2K, which sort of changed things a little bit because the focus changed. After that, it went back to sort of innovation. So I moved into more doing sort of mentoring, coaching, and giving training courses. So probably about a third of my time was giving training, and the rest of the time, as you said, we're sort of real world, people. We do real things, and if I so in the sort of the last sort of few years, I've worked for people like the UN, NATO, investment banks, as well as public authorities, in all sorts of different roles, including business analysis as well. So that's basically my background really. I just want to say I'm incredibly lucky because I've also been to many countries, which I never expected to do. So it's opened up many doors, if you like, and um, in terms of understanding what it's all about. But everybody wants the same sort of thing, but you just got to make it work. So I've been very lucky. So that's sort of basically my background.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So let's get into our discussion here. So the first part of our discussion, I'd like to ask you. I know you're a veteran project
Yeah.
manager. You've had a lot of success. You've had a lot of lessons learned, I'm sure, along the way as well. So let's talk a little bit about
Uh,
your career, and if you can think back a
yeah.
little bit, maybe get in your time machine here and go back.
Times.
Um, is there anything that you got wrong or maybe did incorrectly in project management for far too long before you fixed it?
Yeah, I'll just get in the TARDIS, okay? I mean, you could Doctor Who thing. I'll just go backwards in time here. I like where you called me a veteran as well. That was almost a compliment, really, because I could be called older than a veteran, could be called vintage. Um, I think that in terms of what I got wrong was probably not realizing that you are just part of the cog in the machine, and so you're focusing on what you are doing because that's what you're asked to do, and that you're not aware of the bigger picture, or rather you might be aware of it but not the elements around it. So it's a bit like if you are going to a new country, so you're going to an airport. You know what you expect to do. You turn up, you go through the passport, you get your luggage, so you know all that. But when you go to, say, a different country, there's other elements that you're not aware of. And so I think that was probably where the challenges I sort of got wrong. I mean, it is going back quite a long time, because once I suddenly realized that, it was absolutely key to get a better understanding before you start doing work or getting the team to do work. Because remember, as yeah, you're leading a team, and why would you ever be a leader if you're not if you don't give the confidence? So I'd probably say that's probably my biggest sort of point of learning, really, to recognize that you're just a part of a solution. You're not the solution. Okay.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what advice would you have liked to have heard earlier on in your PM career, do you think?
um I suppose that probably the best one is, well, if I said to you that the most infrequently used word by a project manager is no, I think the advice that I probably would say is learn how to say no. But I don't mean be aggressive with it, but learn how to say no in a diplomatic way, because what will happen is that you're in this world which is moving. You're doing your work, and things happen, and people, we know, we talk about people change their minds, and we know that, I mean, if you're familiar with Agile, they talk about embracing change. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at is saying, if somebody asks you for something, you've only got 24, well, I say 24 hours in a day, but I mean, you've only got a certain amount of time. You've got to be able to say no. Yeah, you can't have this, or this doesn't work. And once you start to, once I started to learn how to say no, it not only made life easier for managing the project, but it meant you started to protect the team, but also protect the business. Because the people who are asking you to make the change, you were going back and saying, this doesn't make sense. It wasn't a challenge, but saying, are you sure you want to do this now? As opposed to going, yeah, because traditionally the project manager was in a role that they were told what to do, and you thought you just had to do whatever you were told. Now, that is going back in my time machine. For those online now, may think maybe you don't work in that environment, but if in some organizations that is still the case. You're in a hierarchical situation. You will do what I tell you, and they don't realize the impact. So that's how I would. that's probably how I would answer that one. Bringing back the memories, if you see what I mean. Um,
Very good. Very good. My next question here. I think we've all
yeah.
heard old dogs can't learn new tricks, but I think that they can, and I think vintage project managers can still learn too. So I'm curious, what has been what has been your most recent lesson learned in your PM career? What's something that you just recently learned?
Well, I think you just put the firstly put the caught it really, because you said what have you learned, and that's what I'd say is you don't stop learning, because I'm gonna change the title a little bit, right? Um, One thing I suppose you could say this is a lesson I've learned, and it's probably from the last few years, is instead of calling it a project, I call things a business initiative, because more and more people talk about a project, but we got to think of the bigger picture. So what I've sort of tend to do now is say I've learned to educate the people in the team that we are dealing with the bigger picture. So I mean that is really what I would say there. So I like to call it business initiative, which means you're getting, because you're getting the business people inside. Again, if you're looking at things like Agile, Agile's not new. Agile just was happened to come about in 2001, but it was based on things that happened in the early days. But always because the downside was that the business people didn't get involved. So I like to do that. So that's one thing, is to I try and introduce that as soon as I can, working with the business initiative. And the other thing is more generic, is that you've got to recognize that the people in the team, if you're at the ones that are close to you, or sorry, your stakeholders, are are knowledgeable. You know, they work in their own environments, but you got to realize that they have a lot of understanding, and you got to adapt with them. You said about learning new tricks, and you it's more about a lot of techniques we use. There's no smoke without fire. There's no real new techniques, but you've got to be able to adapt, and therefore you've got to be adapt with the people. So I think the learning and the new tricks, it's like if you want to talk about the dogs, it's having a dog, and if you've got a dog and you take the dog for a walk, if that dog goes with another person, they don't know how to walk the dog, if you see what I mean. And so you've got to adapt with it. So I think that's really the most important thing. I think the pace of change is in terms of the way people sort of are is really the key thing. If you want to give an example, take something like COVID. It's really moved forward the things like communication, the way people are much more comfortable coming online, going on camera, speaking to microphones, as opposed to just sending an email. Right, go back 10 years and it wouldn't be so comfortable. But now, what I'm saying, everybody's comfortable, not just the people in the business, but everyone seems comfortable. So that's probably what I've learned. Don't stop learning, but be aware of what's happening in the world around you. And so that's what I would say. Okay.
Great, great. Yeah, thank you for that. If any of our participants have a question, just a reminder, you can drop that in the chat pod. John is here to answer your questions about whatever's on your mind related to project management. Uh, please, please go ahead
Yeah,
and
yeah.
drop that
You
in
ask,
there.
you ask me about anything, I don't mind.
Yeah. So uh, today's when you think about and you see a lot of today's
Yeah,
project managers in the
yeah.
classroom, a lot of from folks just starting out all the way to people who have been in it for a while. You're training them, you're coaching them. Just curious, what do you think today's project managers could really learn from veteran project managers like yourself?
That's an interesting one. I think that you can learn the techniques. You can go to a book, you can go on courses, do all of that. But I think that the key area is related to people. Um, to me, 85% of project management is people, and knowing how to speak to people, how to deal with people, um, of all different types. You're going to be talking to business people, you're going to be talking to people working in your team. And I'll give an example. Is if you go to, say, stay in a hotel, you meet a lot of people. Um, but one of the things I talk about on a course, actually, when I do stakeholder management, is I say, well, who's the most important person in a hotel to you if you stay in a hotel? And I get, oh, the front desk and, or the concierge. I said, but I said, well, who else? Who are your stakeholders? And the key one is to me, the housekeeper, the one who goes in your room every day, and cleans the room. And I made it a point of saying hello, good morning, how are you? Or thank you. Um, and it's almost like you recognize everybody for who they are. And so I think that from if you want to call it an experienced project manager from one of a rather vintage or veteran, is that you recognize that everybody has a part to play. Somebody said to me many years ago that if you get a problem, look in the area you thought was the least important, and that is probably where the problem is. And I've always remembered that. That was in very, I mean, I really went back in time then, and I found that to be so true. So I think that in terms of learning off experienced people, it's more about recognize that you've really got to understand the people, and once you do that and understand how they can contribute the roles they're going to play, then don't dismiss anyone. Everyone is important. I could give examples where a mistakes happened or a problems happened because nobody thought to talk to the correct person, the correct user, because they thought they weren't important. Do you want an example? I can give an example if you'd like.
I'd love one.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Um, I know you may not remember this, but you might remember when people are in trays and out trays before we had sort of electronics, if like computers were coming in. Do you remember that, Jen? In trays and out trays? Do you ever remember that?
I, I'm afraid I don't.
I was going to say you saw in a black and white movie, but because everything was paper driven, imagine there was no, if you were lucky, you had a phone on your desk, but most people didn't have phones. So you'd have people the inbox would come in, they've got the paper, and you'd work on the paper, and then anything that wanted to go anywhere, you'd put in the outbox or your tray. So, and then this thing will happen, you see, at some point during the day or overnight these magic elves would appear. And suddenly the next morning you come in and your out tray was empty and your in tray was full. Yeah, it's amazing. And so you thought, okay, then what happened was as businesses were starting to invest in computing, because it wasn't called IT then, they said, well, paying all this money for this calculator, what can we do? Well, as we'd started to get screens and things like keyboards, things we take for granted now, they said, well, where can we get value? Well, maybe you can replace manual processes. So when they started looking at, and say email came in and that type of thing, they said, well, we could use it, but no, people couldn't cope with that. So they said, well, why can't we just replace the paper with documents and send it? So they said, okay, we'll do this. And people can gain control their in tray and out tray. So what would happen is IT, as it was then becoming called, would replace the system of paper based and say, right, you can now send a mail to, yeah, so I'm going to send a mail to you, Jennifer, okay? And we get all these complaints. Well, we're sending stuff, nobody's replying, it's not going to the right place. And you go, but you're saying where you want it to go, and but it's not getting to the person. And when we looked at it, we realized that the people weren't where they said they were, because we were using this list that was updated by HR. And where we thought they were, according to the list, electronically, that wasn't where they really were, because they'd moved. And so I said, well, how did it work before? And what actually happened before was you put something in your outbox, the guys in the post room would get it and go and look at it and go, oh, that person's not there anymore, they're somewhere else, and they would change it. and it would then get to the right person. But we didn't speak to anybody. We didn't speak to them. We didn't know they did that. And hence why a lot of the reputation of IT was the systems don't work, because we weren't able to talk to the right people. People didn't expect us to talk to those people. And so I'm going to be saying it's still the same now. It's so difficult to get to the right people because you get to certain levels, but you really need to get to the persons that's doing the job, because they're the ones that do the job, and they do something that's a little bit different to what's actually stated. You probably heard of the as a business analyst, you create the as is position and the to be position. And I'll say, if you look at the current way people work, you look at the documentation, often it's not kept up to date, so the as is becomes an as was. But because nobody
Hmm.
goes and updates it, it means you're updating something that isn't actually there. So when you deliver it, it doesn't match, and good people get upset. So there's. I hope you like the example, um,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
a
There's some
basic
great advice
example.
in there too.
Yeah, I mean it's a basic example, but that's what I'm saying. As you, when you grew up through all these sort of manual systems and the way things were done and saw the mistakes, they weren't deliberate. Nobody goes out of their way to make mistakes, but you realize that, to be honest, we haven't learned very much. We still have trouble in some getting to do this, and I can't put a finger on it and say why. Um, the only thing I could say is that if you end up talking to people, like I said in the post, well, let's say go more up to date. Let's say I'm to working at the UN. We're putting a system in and we're going across the missions. We want to talk to people in the missions. There was one guy, this is a few years ago. I'm working at the UN, and they basically ran the mission, and we were going through a new system, etc., etc. He said, so what would happen if you were asking me to do this and somebody was pointing a gun at me? He said, how's this system going to help me? And it was like total silence in the room, because these missions are often in hostile countries. And that's what I'm saying. Yeah, and it wasn't meant to be a joke. He was quite serious about it. But, he was explaining that, at times I can't do this because of the scenario. Does that sort of make sense?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. So,
Okay,
yeah.
so yeah, I really appreciate the examples there. That really highlights
Yeah.
the point there. We do have one question here from the
Yeah,
chat
sure.
pod. Circling back to you mentioned earlier that one of the biggest lessons is knowing when to say no, or
Yes.
being comfortable enough to say no.
Yes.
Um, but saying no is hard. How much have you
Yes.
had to compromise when saying no? And I would, and a second part of that, do you have any tips on priorities as well? Prioritizing works
Oh,
and
okay.
compromising,
Okay.
in order to say.
Let me talk, say the first bit about saying no is that before you say no to someone, um, you don't want it to be just a straight reaction. Although you might hear it and you say want to say no, you got to back it up. So what I would say is the first thing you want to do is say you're saying no, but you got to give the reasons why. So what you can do is you may have come across a technique. If not, you can called impact analysis. An impact analysis is simply saying, if this happens, what's going the impact going to be? And when you look at an impact analysis, you look at six things. Time, is it going to impact your time? Cost, is it going to what is it could be cost more or less? Scope, is it going to change the work you have to do? Quality, does it mean it's going to affect the product that's going out? Does it impact the benefit in terms of the return on investment, or does it affect the overall risk to achieving the objectives? If you, before you say no, can do this, and you may have to go and speak to some of the other guys in the team, and you go back and say, if we do this, then this is going to happen. And if you're saying no to a business person, you've got to indicate the impact it's going to have the um, on the benefits, the return on investment. Uh, if you say so, the point is you make them aware that the decision to do it would maybe not give them what they think they're going to get. So you've got to do that, because that justifies the word no. If you're dealing with looking upwards, right? If you're looking downwards towards the team, again, if somebody comes up in a team and says, I got this great idea, you can't say no. I like them to, again, explain the idea. But then I want them, I said, right, have you thought this through? And again, almost do the same impact analysis. Say, but if we do this and it affects time, does that mean something's got to give? So it's about getting the justification for saying it. Uh, the way I think of it quite simply is if I'm dealing with business people, I've got to hit the dollars. In other words, if it affects the dollars, that usually works. If it's a technical person, what you've got to make certain is you're not dismissing them. Right? It could be even a really an idea that isn't going to fly, but if you don't acknowledge it and let them work it out and go through it with them, they're not going to come up with other ideas. And the danger with, if I'm looking downwards, is they'll start to do work without telling you because they think it's a great idea and you're not going to listen. So therefore, you want them to listen. So, like, if you may, I don't know who's on the call, maybe does Agile, but you've maybe heard of a backlog. What I say is, look, great idea, let's put it on the backlog. So in other words, it's made visible to the team, they can see it, and we can discuss it. In other words, you're acknowledging their idea. Um, so that's how I would the part we say about how to say no. You can't just you've just got to make certain you can justify it. Oh, sorry, what was the other part, Jen? Again, that was that part. And then there was
Yeah, that
the,
was that pretty well answers it, I think. But
yeah,
it
you
was
think
just
so? Yeah.
in terms of
There was a,
compromising.
oh, the
Do
compromise.
you, yeah.
Right. Yeah, oh, prioritization. That's the word, right. Um,
Mm,
it's interesting about things like prioritization. There's only a number of ways to with techniques like you probably may have heard of Moscow or Kano. These are just different ways of doing it. But what you have to do is to, again with prioritization, start look and say, so let's put value on it. And what's the most important? So I'll give an example. When I was writing payroll systems, because when I moved after engineering, I had to write payroll systems. One of the things I took, by the way, from engineering, and I took it into the commercial world, was the fact that when I was doing the engineering, where I was doing things like power systems, like controlling electricity, water, oil, imagine you had a power cut because of a bit of my software. How would you feel? You wouldn't be very happy with me. So there's a life risk involved because it could be that it actually takes out a hospital. Okay. By the way, I did put part of London into darkness for 20 seconds, Jen, but that's another story. Um, uh, um, so the point is when I went into the commercial world and doing payroll, I realized that that's still life risk because if you didn't pay somebody, it meant maybe they couldn't pay their bills. So that's one thing. Maybe that's maybe about learning is that everything we do has got a life risk to it because we're delivering an output that somebody's going to use, and they make decisions on it. So with the prioritization element, it's very much saying how important is how critical is it, right? What's going to be the impact again? And so we talk about how do we prioritize things, and maybe the question's prompted. Please, if I've missed the mark, please let me know. But when you people want something, they want everything. Well, and so if they want everything, everything's asked to have. I'll say, so what would you like me to deliver first? That's a very easy way to get prioritization. But don't talk about, well, I'll do Moscow or Kano and confuse people. Just say, so what would you like first? Um, if I can't get that across, what I'll sometimes do is say, right, I'm going to give an example here, guys. And I've got the people in the room. I like workshops, you see. I like working with people. And I suppose that's another thing as a PM. I don't consider myself somebody who just does planning. That's not PM work. So I've got people in the room and I'll say, right, guys, I'm going to give an example. Suppose you listed, right, you've got 1 hour from when you get up in the morning to when you leave the house to go to work, to drive to work. In that hour, write down a list of all the things you do. And I this is a practical thing. I'm not just this is what I do. So they'll go okay, and they'll put down all sorts of things like they'll read the paper, get dressed, go for a shower, feed the goldfish, look at the email, feed the kids, whatever. I say right. Suppose you've only got half an hour instead of an hour. What would you drop? And then they have a bit of discussion. You find that some of the things are obvious, like you better feed the kids, and things like this. Um, And we go through that. So suddenly that list gets smaller. Say, right, you've only got 15 minutes. What would you do? And that starts making them really think. And they go, because it's a real life, you see. People have been in this situation. And so what I'm doing is I'm narrowing it down. And then what I end up with is, right, you got 5 minutes when you get up and you got to get out, you've overslept. And you're down to the critical things. And if you're familiar with prioritization, they're the things you have to do. And so that's an example type technique I use. I don't know what it's called, but it's just what I've been using for years to demonstrate. Say, right, now you understand what we're doing. If you're giving me all this work to do, we've only got this amount. We've got to narrow it down. So let's have that discussion. So I give them the technique with a simple example, and then I get them to do it. So that's sort of
Okay.
my approach,
Very good.
really. Okay. So,
Excellent. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
what I find is people prefer to walk the dog than feed the kids. So,
Those are the things that stay. The
yeah,
5 minutes.
yeah.
Good to know. Good to know.
Or I'll say, oh, we give the kids to the neighbours to let them worry about. Yeah, they can go next door to get fed. We've got to look after our dog. It's actually quite amusing. Actually, people have it actually brings a little bit of fun to it. People do quite enjoy that type of technique. Again, these are just examples. I mean, if you're dealing with business people, yeah, at the higher level, I mean, I'll still do something similar, but maybe, but it's just to get the idea of what I'm trying to do. Because there's a phrase now, I don't know whether it will work actually, with you guys. There's a phrase, you can't fit a quart into a pint pot. Have you ever heard of that? Have you ever heard that phrase, Jen?
No, no, that's a new one. That's a new one for
Right.
me.
If in the UK we tend to drink pints. Yeah? Beer as in
Yeah, I'm
pints.
familiar with pints.
Yeah?
Hmm.
Right. Well, if you've got a jug, which is a quart, which is 4 pints, you can't fit a quart into a pint pot.
Oh,
And that's
okay,
what
I
you're
get it
trying to
now.
tell them. Yeah, yeah, you can't do that. It just doesn't fit. All right. There's you can't fit a quart into a
Right.
pint pot. That I went backwards in time. That was pre-vintage, by the way. Just to let you know.
Very good. Oh, okay. So let's pivot. We don't
Yeah.
we have probably about 10 more minutes here. If
All
anybody
right.
has any
That's all
other
right.
questions, definitely
I hope that
definitely
answered the
post
question,
them in the
by the
chat
way.
pod.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. I
think it
hope that
did.
answered the
I think
question.
that did it for me.
Yeah. Hope we made them
Let's pivot
smile
a
as
little
well.
bit.
Yeah. Go on, pivot.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah. Let's pivot.
Let's pivot a little bit. Today's PMs, okay? I've got a couple of
Yeah.
questions
Today's.
on this. Yeah, today's project managers.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
what skills should today's project managers focus on, do you think, to future-proof their careers?
Ooh, that's a good one. In First of all, they've got to get the if we look at the competencies that required by a project manager, um, you've got the if you like the basic. Most people think, oh, planning, let's get it out, working through, giving work out, etc. But you've got to look a little bit beyond that, and I think you've got to. It's not just about you've got to look at the holistic view, basically. So you've got to say project management is not just about planning. Um, I'll give an example because my youngest son was actually did project management, and I said project managers can no longer sit in front of a screen doing planning. Right? They cannot do that. They've got to have a much better approach, bigger approach. So to future proof, I think that yes, you can do the project management basic, if you I'll call it basics project management type qualifications, but you've got to look at those um, areas around project management. I call it the wrapper that goes around it. So, for example, understanding stakeholders. Now, when you do a course in project management, you get stakeholder management according to how what is expected in your project, but you need to look broader and what the stakeholders. So, for example, if I said to you, are you a stakeholder in a UN project? You might say, well, yes, I am because UN could impact me. But the question is, where do they get their funding from? They come from nations, which get it from US taxpayers. So understanding the bigger picture, That helps. So a course, for example, that would be really useful would be financial course for project managers. So non-finance people. So in other words, they're expanding their skills. So future proofing is, I think that certain things are never going to change. The basic skill set isn't going to change. I think the people management isn't going to change. But what's going to be changing around it is the environment they're working in. Right, so I think if you get your core skills right, but not just purely the PM bit, but these elements like understanding about the world you live in, the business world, so the commercial world. So that type of element that will help. Like risk management is a good one. But understanding more the strategic side. So in other words, a project manager moving towards the business environment as opposed to moving into controlling a team. So I think if to answer the question would be look to understand the business domain, in terms of how do businesses work, and look at that element of it, because the core project management stuff isn't going to change. It's the stuff around it, and if you can get an understanding of that, then that would help future proof it. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great answer there. Thank you for that. Um, So I have a couple other questions here, and
Yeah.
they're sort of related to certifications and also
Okay.
the intersection of project management and agile, with which I think
Ha,
you understand that that intersection has grown significantly over the past
the
couple of years.
intersection.
Have you look? Would you like to expand on that a little bit? Looks like you have some thoughts.
The intersection of right. Oh, you're pushing buttons there, aren't you? um, Project management hasn't really changed. At the end of I tell people that I can teach you project management in 20 seconds, which probably scares you to death, considering we're talking about project management, all these courses. Um, but basically, project management, work out what you want to do, plan to do it and finish. So you can do something at home. You're going to go shopping, you plan, you work out, I've got to go shopping because you go and do the shopping, you come back and you finish, job done. But it's the area that you're working in. It's got to change, or you got to understand. And there's a variable. So most project management courses say when you're in this situation, this is what you need to think about, right? So and usually it's because other things are happening. I'm again without going boring you with a history of whatever agile etc. But what happened was in the around the 80s, the businesses started to drift away from wanting to be involved in their capability, building new capabilities. Remember, I'm using the word capability now rather than output, deliverable, or whatever. They business said we need this capability, but they were focusing on expanding because the globalization was coming in. The problem was is that when project management was documented, the first time it was about 1974, which was Prince 2, and 81 was around PMP. Basically what happened was they documented it as though they were building a house because that's what the business understood. At that time, they were talking about the linear approach, which everybody now thinks is called waterfall, although it was never called a waterfall approach, it was linear. And they talked about iterations, but the businesses didn't really get that. So they said, right, we understand the sequence. But what happened was in the 80s, we started moving to a situation where the the guys now writing solutions, which is now becoming computer driven or IT driven, had to work in a different way because the demands on their time and was being driven the deadlines by the business. So they had to invent ways of working. So what you did, you created a way to work to fit into that business environment. Then as we got to the 2000s, the Y2K came along. Businesses stopped doing innovation because they thought of survival. Because the aircraft were going to fall out of the sky and all sorts of things were going to go crazy because of Y2K, because it never happened. Well, Y2K did, but the problems weren't going to be there. When they got out the other side and they all went, these 17 guys went up a mountain to talk about how to develop software, they said, what are the problems in projects? And the 12 principles came out, which said, look, we want to embrace change even late in the project. It meant, tell us if you want to change rather than wait for us to deliver and then say you don't want it. Business people and developers work together. Why? Because we want business people to start committing again. So all these 12 principles were simply there to help the project manager, we'll call it the project manager, to say they always have problems because the demand is the project manager does this, but we got to help him. The way we got through the Y2K was, this is what we're going to do. And then 2 years later, they said, well, we can now apply Agile to project management. But if you look at it, for example, the question I'll say is that if you take Scrum, for example, which is just one approach, and Agile is an approach, it's not a method. Because I can say, if you go to Scrum and say, well, who owns the business case? A lot of people will say the product owner. That's not right, because it doesn't say that. The product owner is the person in the team that actually understands the functionality. They're not the person who's like the sponsor. So we got to a point where if you go to a business and say it's better, it's cheaper, it's faster, why are you going to say no? But if you link it to software, it makes sense. So faster means you're not going to do stuff you don't need. Cheaper, you're not doing that work, so therefore it's cheaper overall, and better because you actually are being allowed to do testing, so you can't compromise testing, because that was always the problem. To get it done on time, people cut testing. So when they went down the Agile over the last 20 years, business agility, I mean, again became like the marketing element. Let's all go down business agility, which is great, but you still got to have the wrapper around it. For example, the business doesn't care what you do to build the product. So you've got to understand the environment, and I call it the wrapper. For example, this is something I'll say when I'm doing, and I cover Agile as well. If I'm doing Scrum, if that's what they want. Now, Scrum, we know, is a framework. So on day one of sprint one, the team's got to be productive. In which sprint you create the initial backlog. And I get silence. They say, well, sprint one. No, it's not. It's beforehand. So that's why sprint zero. That's why Scrum Alliance and Scrum all got a bit of a falling out. But basically, you say, right, what else happens before you get there? And people start to think, well, you've got to put a team together. Yeah, that must make sense. We've got to have some kind of business case to justify the work. We've got to have some kind of idea of how long it's going to take. Otherwise, you do a bit of planning. And when you look at it, you create this project management, as I call it, wrapper, that allows the development team to then build. So when you talk about the intersection, it's I can run a project where some of it I have to do in a very, and I'll call it traditional. Those are things are traditional, where we have to do things in a certain sequence, where we've got external factors. But then we've actually got an element which is very dynamic. So if I was building a house, for example, which I would never do because I'm not a house builder, you can imagine building a house and you've got the walls there and you've got the window, it's the size for the windows, and the person you're building for says, any chance you can make the windows bigger, or can we have an extra window in? You can't do it. It's against you because not only you've got something physical now in place, but you've got to go through all the planning again. But you don't talk about how you're going to decorate the rooms. You don't talk maybe about where all the PowerPoints are going to go. And there's your Agile bit. So that's why the
Okay.
term you may have come across is hybrid, which means that when you look at an initiative, a business initiative, you're going to say, what's the best approach to do this? One thing you might look at, there's a framework called Cynefin, the Cynefin framework, which basically says when you do any initiative, there's something you're going to do, which you know how you're going to do it, straightforward, right? Like a simple approach. They're quite simple. Then you've got something that's going to be a little bit, I don't like words complex and advanced, because what's advanced to one isn't advanced to another. Well, I'll say, look, guys, you got this situation here and you can apply best practice, but you're doing it with a slightly different environment. So let's say you're going to an airport you've never been to. You know what you got to do. You know what you're supposed to, but you're not quite sure. Right? Then you move into the next one, which is you need some innovation. You're really unsure about what's going to happen. Maybe, so you've got to do a bit of research. And then you got the last area, which is total chaos, where that's where, for example, somebody will ring you up and say, we've just had this disaster. What are you going to do? Which means that, if you like, all the formal stuff goes out the window. You just got to fix it. Such as if somebody rings me up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and says the payroll's crashed, I haven't got time to have meetings. I've got to go and fix it because I mentioned about life risk. So,
Mhm.
so when we talk about agile intersection, I like that the fact is in the last sort of 5 years, there's different approaches of trying to come up with sort of the disciplined way of doing things. And what you have to do is to turn around and go and say, well, actually, um, we have to look at the big picture, and it's a combination of all of this element. It's not
Okay.
one size fits all. Does that answer your
Okay.
question?
Yeah, yeah, that does. That was a very thorough answer too. I really appreciate the deep
Yeah.
dive on that because that's a big topic right now for
Yeah.
sure. Okay,
Yeah,
we're just about
so, yeah. Sorry, Jen. What I was going to say was every agile approach came from an environment to fix something in that environment. So Scrum created because they couldn't get a business person involved. Extreme programming was created because you needed to work directly with the people who wanted. That's where user stories come from, right?
Oh, okay.
DSDM was where we had more of a formal approach, which is now called Agile PM. That was created because they didn't want such a big jump into something completely different. They wanted to be able to relate it back to the business. Okay, so all these approaches,
Okay.
then you got lean as well. They're all there because of the environment that people were developing systems in. Okay,
Okay. Yeah, that's great.
there you go.
Um, so I think we're about up to time here. I've got just a couple
Okay,
of extra slides to sort of to click
yeah,
through
sure,
here.
sure.
First of all, I wanted to, of course, thank John Moore. He's one of our best project manager and agile instructors. One of the most popular. Everybody loves him. So if you're looking to take a course with us, I would highly recommend, finding one with John Moore here. He's obviously very knowledgeable and fun too. So I've got a couple of polls here down at the bottom. Be sure to answer those poll questions. You can rate the event, and if you have any suggestions for an upcoming event, that would be great. Just drop it in there. If there's a topic that you'd like to see covered, or an aspect of project management that you're struggling with, or maybe a certification that you're studying for that you'd like a little bit more help with, we'd love to hear about it. We can potentially have an event around that in the future. The slide at the top, the next steps. Be sure to log into your My Learning Tree account, get on that PM LinkedIn community on LinkedIn, go to the account and look at the resources, of course. This slide is just a reminder of your membership benefits that we went over in the beginning, and you can find you'll be able to find the slides and also the recording of this in your My Learning Tree account later on as well. And finally, I just want to thank John Moore one more time for the lively discussion today. Thank you to all who joined and asked questions in the event. And hopefully, we'll see you soon in our LinkedIn community and our next event in October. So, thanks so much and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. This is John Moore, the vintage project manager, dialing out from the TARDIS.